Friedrich Nietzsche has been called his century's most dangerous thinker. But how has the legendary philosopher influenced the Metal Gear games by director and living icon Hideo Kojima? This is a virtual essay. Watch it to find out.
I'm very familiar with the so-called Nietzsche effect, and that's the effect that Nietzsche has on adolescent young males who read him for the first time and begin to name their cars Ubermensch wagons and begin to quote Nietzsche in order to date women who dress in black as I'm dressed today, and the Nietzsche fascination. That characterizes one's first encounter and certainly characterized my first encounter with Nietzsche as well. We need to distinguish the Nietzsche effect and also the effect of his texts from his life radically.
Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was a 19th century German thinker and philologist. Philology is the study of the structure, historical development, and relationship of a language or languages. Nietzsche and his philology we might call the godfather of the 20th century. He's known for his tough, searing wit and his literary and poetic verve. Nietzsche's withering insights into the philosophy and practice of history, knowledge, science, religion, and morality. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born 1844 and died in 1900. His overall philosophy would develop and shift over time, but roughly speaking, Nietzsche was interested in humanity, in its developmental history, and its likeliest futures.
The military has been working towards identifying those genes which are responsible for making effective soldiers.
Walking upright was the decisive difference between our ancestors and other anthropoids. Our brains could get heavier once they were supported by the spinal column. That led to the use of tools and the development of complex communication through language. Only man is capable of this.
Nietzsche wondered about the relationship between our minds and our natures, our ideas, and our dynamics of power.
Now do you remember who you are, what you were meant to do?
But more than just the wandering sort, Nietzsche was a well-known master of suspicion and a seasoned explorer of pessimism.
So patriotism is your excuse for circumventing the Constitution?
And even now you think, as any person would, that this can't be happening. Is it education, morals, faith? Just the imprint of a lifetime of stories? Face to face with oblivion, which is where you are, and you still think that help is coming. The world you were born into is made to save you. Isn't that right? Of course it is. Everyone knows that. Until your last breath, you know it. Without the slightest chance or reason left to them, humans are capable of hope. I'm no different.
If we're to unite the world, literacy must be suppressed. To suppress the information immune system, to borrow your metaphor. That's why we must depend on information control. People need an appropriate context for their lives. A context that's stimulating without being destructive.
Nietzsche approached philosophy like an Arctic explorer. Mentally tough, he had a warrior's resolve and a tactician's cold clarity. Nietzsche was willing to follow truth to the ends of the earth, no matter how ugly or maddening or terrifying. If it was really the truth about life and human beings, Nietzsche would pay any price to know it.
What does it all mean? That's what we're here to find out.
Yeah, right. If we really need to know, the truth will reveal itself. Even if it's ugly.
And that's what made him an almost romantic figure. What also made him sort of knight-like, however, was all this, well, for lack of a less cringe word, manliness, was in service of sincere and total belief. Not in any one philosophy or idea as an absolute, mind you, but in the absolute resolve of Nietzsche's own heart, the courage and conviction of his own will. Nietzsche found the kind of life he wanted to live, and he lived it.
Humans can choose the type of life they want to live. The important thing is that you choose life, and then live.
Fighting not for country, not for government, but for ourselves. If the times demand it, we'll be revolutionaries, criminals, terrorists, and yes, we may all be headed straight to hell. But what better place for us than this?
He found the story, both ugly and beautiful, of all he had faith in, and could learn about, and could teach about, and would bequeath to the future, and he then bequeathed it.
Memories you have, and the role you were assigned are burdens you had to carry. It doesn't matter if they were real or not. That's never the point. There's no such thing in the world as absolute reality. Most of what they call real is actually fiction. What you think you see is only as real as your brain tells you it is.
Then, what am I supposed to believe in? What am I going to leave behind when I'm through?
We can tell other people about having faith. What we had faith in. What we found important enough to fight for. It's not whether you were right or wrong, but how much faith you were willing to have. That decides the future.
At the end of the day, just like Hideo Kojima's MGS, Nietzsche led by example. His philosophy was no typical, dry, academic sermonizing. It was part of him. It beat with Nietzsche's heart and coursed with Nietzsche's blood. Nietzsche lived his philosophy, which may be why his writing, now, even centuries later, still feels so alive. If all this sounds a bit vague, it's because Nietzsche, like really any philosopher punching at his weight, was a complex thinker and well-read conversationist. Philosophy itself is roughly a kind of conversation, a dinner party, a choir. You can miss a lot by singling out any one voice. Even just covering Nietzsche sufficiently for Metal Gear is going to take 2 full-length essays. Instead of making the thinker our focus throughout, though,
the safest way in is from the rear.
We'll approach this from the rear, sprinkling in Nietzsche while focusing mainly on Kojima's games. It may not wind up a comprehensive or even adequate breakdown of Nietzsche's entire corpus, but you will see in great depth and detail how some of his ideas, at least according to my interpretation, foreground or resonate with Kojima's games. Nietzsche's influence on Kojima may be clear as early as the original Metal Gear in 1987. Famously, the philosopher once quipped, "Those who hunt demons should take care not to turn demons themselves, that whenever we should gaze dark into the abyss gazes back." That good can become evil beneath our notice is a major theme, you might say, of Nietzsche's entire oeuvre. This sneaky, corrupting, and secret bind between light and darkness is at the forefront of the first Metal Gear. All along, the man we thought we knew in the game as Big Boss sold us a world of lies. The highest authority we know winds up our worst enemy. Somewhere along the way, the former hero Big Boss must have gazed too long into the abyss. The great monster hunter became a monster himself. He'll stop at nothing to conquer the world, and we've served as his unwitting pawn. All the drama and tension and betrayal of the game up to the end, we'll find was predicated on a small-minded morality that we, along our quest, like our enemies for power, all too readily ate up. At bottom, in Metal Gear 87, there is no real good or evil. There is only competing forms of that most human of all energies, the will to power. What Nietzsche once called the primordial fact of all history. Big Boss realizes in a sense that, as Nietzsche once said, God is dead and we have murdered him. In this case, God might stand in for the state, or specifically America. By concocting a secret plot against his own former country, the US, and military unit, Foxhound, Big Boss wants to effectively overthrow his own fatherland, his own father, and replace him. Big Boss's human cunning allows him to change moral alignment in this way, and believe in a worldview all of his own construction. It is our raw power overcoming his plans that allow us our own rejection and reevaluation of our moral universe. A realization of our own that God, now in the form of Big Boss, is dead.
Any family?
That's not a happy topic for me.
I don't have any family. No. Wait. There was a man who said he was my father.
Where is he?
Dead. By my own hand.
Big Boss.
What? Big Boss? I had no idea.
There was no way you could. It happened in Zanzibar 6 years ago. Only Snake and I know the real truth of what happened there.
So, is it true? Was Big Boss really your father?
That's what he said. That's all I know.
And you were able to kill him, knowing that?
Yep.
How?
He wanted it. Besides, some people just need killing.
That's patricide.
Yep. That's the trauma that Mantis was talking about. The one we share in common.
I'm not like you! Goodbye, Father. I don't need you anymore.
Scholars tell us that the first spy in history was the snake in the book of Genesis. In that story, it was Eve who was tempted by the snake in the Garden of Eden. But this time around, it was I who tempted the snake and got away with the forbidden fruit of knowledge. Forgive me, Snake.
Unlike Big Boss and most of our deceptive support staff over each game, our missions don't afford the luxury of considerations of good or evil. Mostly we Snakes care about simply good or bad, catastrophe or its absence.
There are no heroes in war. All the heroes I know are either dead or in prison, one or the other.
But Snake, you're a hero, aren't you?
Donning the amoral role of a soldier, it's easy to forget what a sin is on the battlefield.
Snake, what's this all about?
Bedtime riding. I wouldn't do that.
You're changing sides now?
Change sides? I don't recall saying I was on yours.
You don't have to do this.
I'm no hero. Never was. I'm just an old killer, hired to do some wet work.
Snake, I know how you're feeling. It's hard for me to believe, too, that a legendary hero like the boss would go over to the Russians. That she'd double-cross us like this. But that's how it is, and if you don't accept it, you'll never be able to beat her.
That's not the problem. In terms of sheer technique, I'll never be able to beat her. I know that all too well.
You've got to do it, Snake. She's your enemy and your objective.
Enemy? We were together for 10 years, and now you tell me she's my enemy?
While we only act and react, strike or sneak, Our handlers and puppet masters do nothing in these games but talk. They frame for us how to think, define for us our terms, and take what we'd call good or bad and transform them into their theatrical notions of right and wrong, good and evil.
Now you're not sleeping, and we're not junkyard hounds. We're diamond dogs.
They spin stories, pass judgments, explain laws. And what they fear and hate most, these masters of civilization that we serve, is the idea of a man of action like ourselves revolting against them, like their deployments of good and evil protect and rebel from the dominance of the stronger type, us.
This is Snake. I'm now inside Strut A of Shell 1.
And by the way, Snake, we're changing your code name for all following communication.
What's wrong with Snake?
Just a precaution. You are now designated Raiden.
The result is a Foxhound Commando. When Foxhound no longer exists, a simulated Solid Snake shaped by VR regimen. Sound like someone you know, Jack?
Nietzsche was chiefly interested in the psychological makeup of society, and how adequately this did or did not correspond to the basics of human nature.
A mere set of norms. The Patriots were those norms. A neural network reduced to its simplest form. That's what they really represented. Uniformity without individual will, without change.
Of course, all societies are human by design, but Nietzsche wasn't entirely sure that all aspects of our natures were being equally taken care of by modern society. In his studies of human history and philology, Nietzsche identified two competing strains, we might even call them languages, of morality. These were moralities, in his terms, of the master and the slave. Maybe none of Nietzsche's philosophy has been more abused or misunderstood than this. He didn't believe, for example, that these masters and slaves were completely mutually exclusive categories. He wrote, one sometimes finds, quote, their close juxtaposition, even in the same man, within one soul, end quote. Nor is master morality somehow better or more preferred. Nietzsche uses these terms specifically within the contextual question of how moral ideas take root and spread among us. It comes down here, as elsewhere for this thinker, to perspective. Masters are those who are somehow stronger or more well off for whatever reason in their given context, and for this fact define their moral universe in terms of what makes them better placed, what makes them different, superior in their own little world.
We only have his word to go on, but Skullface's goal was revenge against those who'd use language to subjugate people. Those corrupting a people's identity by forcing a new tongue on them. Those using the power of language to control information. Naturally, that set his sights on Zero. To Zero, English was simply the most convenient code. But to Skullface, English was a parasite.
Slaves, meanwhile, are of course the opposite, and as you might expect, for Nietzsche, they define morality in terms of universals, of what they are owed and have not been given.
My metal gears shall be the thread by which all countries are bound together in equality. No words will be needed. Every man will be forced to recognize his neighbor. People will swallow their pain. They will link lost hands. The world will become one.
Masters emphasize difference and hierarchies under the banner of honor and nobility.
After I launch this weapon and get $1 billion, we'll be able to bring chaos and honor back to this world gone soft.
Slaves, meanwhile, fixate for Nietzsche on revenge in the name of justice, on equality, and perceiving people at bottom as more the same than they are different.
Big Boss can go to hell.
Both outlooks are completely explained by Nietzsche in terms of perspective, without any appeals to outside ideas of morality or value judgments, not in terms of any innate inferior or superior traits alone. So how do masters and slaves factor into MGS? Well, what the series portrays is a microcosm of the struggle between these two perspectives.
They both misinterpreted her will. And their absolute reverence for her drove them apart. So began the war between Zero and Big Boss. Opposing interpretations, each striving to realize the boss's will. Everything you see today stems from their Cold War. Differences in race, in religion, in ideology. This war they've caused is no different from any other human error in history. It all started with a tiny fork in the path and grew into a great rift.
It was this struggle Nietzsche believed explained all history. Nietzsche himself was, by his own standards, a mix of the two moral perspectives, a slave-like, pessimistic suspector of human nature, and lover of his fellow man to some extent, yet also a master when it came to things like honor, strength of will, and keeping in touch with tradition. The same intermingling, the same moral back and forth, we also find in the characters and conflicts of Metal Gear. Essentially, Nietzsche identified a perennial or lifelong conflict throughout human history between fairness and equality. Of course, both of these words are seriously loaded. To the ruler, inequality is called fairness.
And you think you're qualified to decide what's necessary and not?
Absolutely. Who else could wade through the sea of garbage you people produce, retrieve valuable truths, and even interpret their meaning for later generations?
That's what it means to create context.
It's our responsibility as rulers.
But to the subject or slave, unfairness is called equality.
All you want is power at any cost.
Jack, it's not power I want. What I wanted to take back from the patriots are things like freedom, civil rights, opportunities. The founding principles of this country. Everything that's about to be wiped out by their digital censorship.
Both, when pressured, in other words, tended to prioritize their own interests or will to life, trying to make niches for themselves. As Code Talker tells us in 2015's Metal Gear Solid 5,
it is the way of all organisms to create their own optimal environment. Just look at you and this space.
This drive to optimize our cultural or ideological surroundings that Nietzsche identified, this human latent will to strive for a better future, it's exactly what Nietzsche means by his term will to power. And speaking of differing perspectives and conflicts among ideas, consider that the will to power is to some extent a challenge to the classical Darwinian principle of the will to survival. Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers writing after the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1864, published when Nietzsche was just 20 years old. He wasn't a fan of Darwinism's finer points, nor of English thinkers of his era generally. For Nietzsche, Darwin's idea of the living being was one driven by merely the necessity of achieving the bare minimum for survival. That circled past completely, for Nietzsche, the real question. The question what it is that drives not just man but all life to not only exist but to thrive. As Mantis says in 1998's Metal Gear Solid 1, to mindlessly pass on our DNA, to spread our life force. Conflicts over interpretations like these, even in something as ostensibly objective as science, would be central to The Phantom Pain. Conflicts both in terms of groups, but also across times. The game's inclusion of, say, Archaea and Wolbachia, both microorganisms discovered roughly in the 70s and 80s, its focus on the human biome, huge swaths of which remain even today unknown. The game's homage to Sahelanthropus tchadensis, a controversial and recent discovery scientists are still debating over whether it's truly the missing link between man and apes. All these things draw a big red arrow towards Nietzsche and his general suspicions regarding science. His suspicions that science is in actuality a human construction, however much it is admittedly predicated on observable facts and quote-unquote reason. The facts may be facts in of themselves, but the minute that we attempt to understand them for Nietzsche, we begin the process of interpretation, and the facts no longer, strictly speaking, exist. One of his most famous quotes to this point was included at the end of The Phantom Pain, and Nietzsche's love of languages vis-a-vis The Phantom Pain is a topic that we will just have to wait to get to next time. Okay, so we've covered the idea that there is masters roughly and their slaves. Well, how to account for the recurring, perhaps natural differences between these moralities? Aren't these different perspectives byproducts at bottom, as human ideas, of the same kind of beings? Nietzsche's explanation, simply put, is the will to power. The same essential life force is driving for him both competing factions, the master and the slave. Just as good is tied for him to evil, master becomes tied to slave. One suggests automatically, even as just an idea, the other.
Wait, let me finish. Listen, MSF never would have gotten this big if it weren't for them. This mercenary business we built, someday it's gonna be a new driving force in the world economy.
I'm the one who got caught up with Cypher, a group above nations, even the US. And I was the parasite below, feeding off Zero's power. I'm gonna make him give back our past, take back everything that we've lost, and I won't rest until we do.
Approaching Mother Base.
Why did you disguise yourself as Master?
So I could manipulate you more easily. And you performed quite well, I must say. Although the boys at the Pentagon are probably saying the same thing.
What the hell are you talking about?
Following orders blindly with no questions asked, you've lost your warrior's pride and become nothing more than a pawn, Snake.
What?
There's one more person I want to introduce you to, Snake.
Huh?
Speaking of snakes, you remember the boss, don't you?
To begin with, we're not what you'd call human. Over the past 200 years, a kind of consciousness formed layer by layer in the crucible of the White House. It's not unlike the way life started in the oceans 4 billion years ago. The White House was our primordial soup, a base of evolution. We are formless. We are the very discipline and morality that Americans invoke so often. How can anyone hope to eliminate us? As long as this nation exists, so will we.
This is what I learned from the Major. And then it hit me. It was he who should feel my wrath. He and the code he chose as basis for control.
That which serves the higher class of men for nourishment or refreshment must be almost poison to an entirely different, lower order of human beings. Books for the general reader are always ill-smelling. The odor of paltry people clings to them. Where the populace eat and drink, and even where they reverence, it is accustomed to stink. One should not go into churches if one wishes to breathe pure air. Friedrich Nietzsche. It happens frequently that a scientific head is placed on an ape's body, a fine exceptional understanding in a base soul, an occurrence by no means rare, especially among doctors and moral physiologists. Friedrich Nietzsche. As we all know, Metal Gear Solid's primary subject matter is nuclear weapons. That science and reason could produce such incredibly destructive instruments of power would have surprised the liberal thinkers and scientists of the Enlightenment. But not Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought so-called enlightened, democratic, liberal ideas all too often merely treated words like science and truth and reality as prosthetics, connecting them to the subject of their secret phantom pain as modern, learned men, God, and God's absence. Why assume, as most if not all of these thinkers did, that in the absence of God there still remains a moral, knowable, rational universe? That there can still exist, through enlightened reasoning via, say, math or science, a realm of pure and perfect objective ideas. There's an old saying Nietzsche might have liked: wherever you go, there you are. For Nietzsche, through the spectacular illusions and passions of our moral and epistemic ideals, we become disguised from ourself.
Unless the light is put out, the shadow cannot be erased. So long as there is light, there is shadow.
They try to put on a pretty face for the media, but this is the grim reality of it. We provoked and encouraged your hatred. And you opted for vengeance, just as we planned.
All orchestrated?
Taking our shadows, in the figure of our notions of good and evil, to exist independently and as verification of themselves.
Why do you suspect me? What did I do? I'm on your side. What about him?
In no time, he'll be telling tales about the black-hearted diamond dogs. The shining white knight, blabbering on about our injustice, hiding behind his fool's idea of morality. And all the other fools will stand around, nodding with every word he says.
No. One day he'll see through the lies he's built up, realize what kind of man he really is. What goes around comes around. You can't run from yourself forever.
No one is such a liar as the indignant man. Friedrich Nietzsche. Language will continue to talk of opposites where there are only degrees and many refinements of gradation. Friedrich Nietzsche. To quote the preface of Nietzsche's text, Genealogy of Morals, we are unknown to ourselves, we knowers, and with good reason.
All the missiles on these disposal sites are supposed to be dismantled. It's not that easy to get your hands on an ICBM.
That used to be true. But since the end of the Cold War, you can get anything if you have enough money and the right connections.
You killed her and locked her body in the pod.
I wouldn't! Don't treat me like one of you! I can't just kill anyone whenever I feel like it! I'm a normal human being!
Oh, I see. So you just shut her inside and waited for her to die.
You named him D-Dog, but it's obvious anyone could see that's a wolf! Because you're all a bunch of wild dogs! You wanted to believe he was too, to feel some connection, to fight your loneliness. You wanted something to cling to prove you deserve to be alive. You wanted to forget the death, your sins, so you'd cling on to dogs, or wolves, or even Big Boss. The boss is the same, isn't he? Every one of you is alone. That's why you suspect your own. I know, because I do the same. I'm one of you too. Alone.
Nietzsche saw the Enlightenment and its heirs as mere sorry excuses for what the ages of science themselves destroyed. Instead of capital G God, Europe for Nietzsche now had capital T truth. And nowhere was this prosthetic sensibility more evident for Nietzsche than politics and philosophy. All too often humanity has called discovery that it has more than a little self-invented. The future, Nietzsche believed, could only truly evolve out of a conscious awareness of our own follies, and the future was Nietzsche's central concern. He saw equal parts potential as terrible danger in its misty abyss. The philosopher was far ahead of the curve, predicting that in the face of modern life and all its disappointing emptiness and unoriginality, many would long for a return to some semblance of the past. But rather than espousing this conservatism, Nietzsche thought we seem to be continually repeating the same central mistakes over and over again, as we take our ideas to be perfect stand-ins for the real world. Whether the past or the future, whether masters or slaves, for Nietzsche, humans almost never innocently stumble onto an idea. They invent, author, create ideas, create values, as psychological byproducts of pre-existing points of view. Ideas for Nietzsche, no matter how noble-seeming or advanced, emerge from the universal life force, namely the will to power, what we might today recognize under the more anodyne phrase self-preservation. Anything that preserved a certain kind of people, whether later retroactively rechristened as immoral or wrong or not, for Nietzsche stemmed exactly from the same will to power that motivated all our modern ideas of the moral and the right. Nietzsche, in his way, was trying to conceptualize human beings scientifically, with most of our values and folkloric terminology removed. He would go on to directly influence the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. So the easiest way to think about Nietzsche's ideas might be in terms of psychology. Rather than the soulless and mindless meat automatons implied to be our natures from modern science, Nietzsche understood what really drives human beings: behavior, language, and history. It all must at bottom be psychological. Psychology is the queen of all sciences, for whose service the other sciences exist. Friedrich Nietzsche.
Snake, we're not tools of the government or anyone else. Fighting was the only thing I was good at. But at least I always fought for what I believed in.
He's experienced all your missions on record and shares all your knowledge and experience to make him believe that he's the one true big boss. No one around him will doubt that he's the big boss they know. So, is he the real big boss or a stand-in? What does that mean to him? Nothing. The human brain is capable of many illusions, of pain, of the future. What happens from here depends on his skill. You can vouch for that.
Trying to explain how our minds, bodies, and physical reality work, for Nietzsche, is quite unrelated to the underlying deeper question, the question of what they're working towards. In other words, why. Really why they exist.
From the moment we're thrown into this world, we're fated to bring each other nothing but pain and misery.
As Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, philosophy is this very tyrannical impulse itself, the one that believes in itself, always creating and recreating the world in its own image. End quote.
It was enough to make me sick.
Nietzsche uses terminology that might make his ideas on the genealogy or family tree of moral ideas hard to grasp. But remember, I compared him to a scientist, doctor, and psychologist. Rarely does a Nietzschean term express a hard value judgment in the way it might in everyday speech. A famous if unpublished essay of his, for example, was named On Truth and Lie in a Non-Moral Sense. Nietzsche's whole philosophy was that ideas carry baggage, signatures of a specific, all-too-human, limited point of view. Often Nietzsche speaks not of what a thing or group is in themselves, but in terms of what they simply do. Today, in the philosophy of science, such a viewpoint we call functionalism. The purpose of a trait for functionalism is and only is what it does. Nietzsche might have held something similar. In his mouth, the words master and slave must be severed from all value implications. Nietzsche, contrary to popular belief, thanks to the parasitic hijacking of his persona by the Nazis, was neither anti-Semitic nor a nationalist. He did not believe in master races that, by virtue of their strength, deserve to conquer and oppress the slaves. Rather, strength Nietzsche merely offers as the mechanism by which masters distinguish themselves from slaves to begin with. Strength for Nietzsche is only inherently good to the extent it functions as a tool for exercising and amassing the latent, all-consuming life force, our will to power.
Open your eyes! What you're doing is murder! Plain and simple! All you ever create is war! War and violence can never lead to peace!
Nietzsche's point here was that at bottom, masters and slaves do not exist in of themselves. They are two separate instances of what is at bottom the same fundamental underlying human drives. The slaves are merely the have-nots in this scenario, the masters the haves. But neither is more inherently moral or immoral than the other. Far from the Nazified way that his terminology was posthumously abused and defaced, Nietzsche did not nor ever support the right of the strong to dominate and enslave the weak. Rather, he merely accepted such a dynamic was, is, and will be for human beings inevitable. The development of the ubiquitous proliferation of our modern Judeo-Christian notions of right and wrong, Nietzsche traced along the historical divergences of our ancestors' notions of good and evil. Nietzsche believed ever since it first played out, as the great Jewish slave revolt against their masters in Rome in 66 CE, similar if not the same exact process has shaped and reshaped over and over again our contemporary ideas, and with them our sense of the world, of ourselves, of that world's place within a moral universe that we in general still believe exists. All Nietzsche is really trying to do is disabuse us of any notions of pure neutrality or objectivity. History for Nietzsche, and this is one of his central beliefs, gets written by the victors and continuously rewritten and contained by the present and the future. It's a never-ending struggle, a process, a game that never ends. History and morality are living things for Nietzsche. Their health and all-around constitution lives or dies according to use, to we, the people, co-creating and enforcing and using them. The Jewish revolt Nietzsche speaks of bears striking resemblance to the American Revolution.
George Washington took office as the first president of the United States of America 200 years ago today. And it happened right here.
They regulate the country's various interests through controlled presentation, staging a drama that is palatable to the general masses. Can you imagine what would happen if they ceased to function? Picture a massive political vacuum, a space that every powermonger will try to fill for their own greedy ends. I'm talking about an unregulated power struggle, panic, civil war, chaos.
We were going to declare another independence, the dawn of a new nation, here. The end of the Patriots' secret rule, liberation of this country. This was where it was supposed to begin. This is where freedom could have been born.
First Big Boss, then Zero. Liberation is at hand.
And whether ancient Rome or its heirs and would-be replacement empires of Europe and America, Nietzsche did not believe, strictly speaking, in equality, or liberty, or even the so-called rule of law. In short, none of the values ensconced in democracy and nationalism much appealed to him. For Nietzsche, the power of the slaves they found capable of fighting their masters with derived from what he called the first truly interesting human act, the revolution. Slaves redefined the terms of the world, calling the attributes that had allowed their domination by their masters not only bad, but evil. evil, in some sense, was the original revolution. Morality for Nietzsche only then truly evolved as a weapon by which this never-ending back and forth within the human heart would be forever waged. We might also compare this idea here with terrorism. Smaller, weaker groups lack the raw power necessary to free themselves by force, so they turn to terrorism to change how the world morally perceives their struggle. This is the same slaves' revolt logic playing out again and again. Revolutions never emerge neutrally from nowhere, but as byproducts and extensions of a particular point of view, a vested interest, a certain perspective. Again, to many ears, Nietzsche's talk of equality surely rings false. But the irony is that it's largely because most of us today live in democratic nation-states with all the baggage that entails, that equality is something we construe as a question of group against group. It's true Nietzsche lived and wrote at a time when science was becoming radically racialized, and anthropology and Orientalism and eugenics were producing a collective cache of so-called sophisticated ideas that today we'd rightly recognize as racist. However, I'd still argue that Nietzsche's talk of equality and types of human being and so on are primarily not rooted in some semblance of popular race-based biology. To the contrary, Nietzsche was suspicious of the very idea of a pure race, let alone anything popular, and thought our entire categories for knowledge and science were seriously flawed.
That dog's all grown up now. You mean Didi? Yeah. Didn't seem to take that long, did it? You think he's really even a dog?
Of course he's a dog. What's wrong with you?
Well, I just mean he looks more like a wolf to me.
That's crazy talk. He's a dog, you hear me? A dog!
So you think he's a dog, I get it. Keep a freaking lid on it. What's important is he's one of us, regardless if he's a dog or a wolf.
He is a dog,
Caution. Rain approaching.
Why do I even bother?
Nietzsche spoke mostly in terms of individuals and their psychology, even as he also seriously interrogated the existence of a single self to begin with. Nietzsche thought all groups of people had something unique to bring to the human experiment. For example, Nietzsche, roughly half a century ahead of history, really liked the idea of a European Union. He wanted to see a return to aspects of the pre-nationalist ages, when diverse, polyglot groups found it much easier to live together in the same polity. Like the boss from Metal Gear Solid 3, Nietzsche believed that the world was truly one. He had no problem living in a multiracial, multi-language speaking world, but that didn't translate to a blanket acceptance of the idea that all men are created equal. After all, from the modern standpoint of genes and psychology and physiology, this dogma when it comes to individuals clearly falls flat, and even Nietzsche's era could sense this. Are the lives of every group worthy the same respect and political recognition? Perhaps. I certainly think so. But setting aside the superstition of hard distinctions, superstitions that are nonetheless necessary for life, such as race or gender, at bottom, people are people, and not all people are the same. Some are more capable or thoughtful or hateful than others. To attribute difference to fixed parameters here, like race, is only one extremely flawed interpretation of this human, all-too-human variety. Nietzsche, who of course lived before the ascendancy of gene theory, believed not so much in fixed, purely biological differences among large, clear-cut groups, but in differences in terms of cultural heritages or ideas. While physiology for him ultimately might explain the psychology of everyone from the priest to the murderer, the form that a weak or a stupid or courageous or power-hungry person takes depends on the times. This is why Nietzsche thought the same group could be slaves one day and masters the next. He didn't believe in fixed, essential categories of race or really most others. Everything for him came down to context relative to a given age and perspective. It is because he chose as the quintessential revolution that of monotheists against Rome, the Jewish revolt. People have been misconstruing Nietzsche as some kind of racist reactionary ever since. No thanks, of course, to the Nazis. People like to forget that Judaism and Christianity, not to mention Islam, all emerged as cousins from the same family tree.
Every era needs its symbols to control the people. Whether it be the stars and stripes, or the hammer and sickle.
Nietzsche was so opposed to the racist right wing in Germany that he severed his friendship with the composer Richard Wagner over the question of Wagner's anti-Semitism. He also penned a work titled The Antichrist, about as far from a conservative outlook as you could get. He did see the charm and allure in Yesterday. After all, as a philologist, you might say 70% of Nietzsche's being consisted of words written by long-dead men. But Nietzsche, first and foremost, was a lover of the future. He basically gave his whole life to the mission of raising that coming future to its fullest potential, a potential that past generations, even his own, would fail surely to recognize, a triumph that would go unrecognized in his own time.
That's what it means to create context.
I'll decide for myself what to believe and what to pass on.
But is that even your own idea?
Or something Snake told you.
That's the proof of your incompetence right there. You lack the qualifications to exercise free will.
That's not true. I have the right.
Often the former slaves, at bottom, seek to merely become the new masters, such as the tension and dynamic suggested by the binary power struggle that in practice separates the haves from have-nots, the weak from the strong, the masters from the slaves. Nietzsche strongly wished to challenge the underlying universalist assumptions necessary for conventional, strong moral ideas. Why, he asks, does no one question at the start whether, say, good is always superior to evil, or even truth always better than untruth? Lies and illusions, Nietzsche believed, were not bugs in the human operating system, they were features. That a thing happens to be untrue is mostly irrelevant for whether or not it has its uses. Nietzsche didn't think we should throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater here. Some untruths are worthy of our disdain, sure, but not by virtue of their truth. It's the functional usefulness, the life-sustaining and strengthening properties of the thing that truly decides for Nietzsche its merit. This means slaves are not always, or inherently inferior or bad for human ideas, any more than masters in their form of morality are always good. Nietzsche believed time and life play out as a balance between these twin interrelated binaries, really separated by instincts for life on the one hand and instincts for death on the other.
Cypher will rewrite the records, and I will vanish from human memory. But the thirst for revenge that I have planted will infest the system. No one can stop it now. Sahelanthropus will unleash that thirst onto the future. Major, I'm burning up!
Live, Snake. It's all I can say to you.
Ideas that have the power to benefit and grow humanity, and those with the power to harm, debase, or diminish it. And do not assume that over time these differing functions can't get fulfilled by the exact same idea. As the boss tells us in MGS 3, today's good might easily become tomorrow's evil. And here we have as the perfect case in point the tragic transformation over the games from the Greco-romantic-like hero Naked Snake to the evil monotheistic-like arch-villain, the Satan of the story, Big Boss. The pagan age of demigods and heroes conveyed as the Second World War, Metal Gear shows us gradually transforming into the Cold War and post-Cold War eras, and their morality of binary opposites. History, a stage divided between two actors, playing a mutually reinforcing role of absolute good versus absolute evil. If our ideas and our historic variegated vibrancy become trapped and diminished, future generations are denied their chance to perform their own slaves' revolt. Nietzsche worried that only then will the flames of human ambition risk dying out, and the final process of revolution, the transvaluation of all values, will become permanent, producing as a byproduct the shell of a human being Nietzsche knew and feared as the so-called last man. As the translators of Genealogy of Morals tell us here in the introductory essay, quote, Nietzsche's training as a philologist inclined him to the view that no fact exists apart from an interpretation, just as no text speaks for itself. Things don't necessarily logically progress in science towards a goal or telos on their own. This gets shaped by contingencies and power dynamics. Nietzsche worried that what we call civilization is taking the wild animal that formerly was known as man and housebreaking him, making him a herd animal, an animal that comes to take taming to be an end in itself. What modern so-called Western enlightened society calls better, Nietzsche believed man would strive to become all the time. Better meaning more comfortable, more mediocre, more indifferent.
I've completed 300 missions in VR. I feel like some kind of legendary mercenary.
Nietzsche worried that Enlightenment thinkers and scientists were making a major assumption that nature is a realm that exhibits rational and well-ordered egalitarianism. Nietzsche believed essentially that these scientists and philosophers were imposing their own worldview on the world and using that as evidence for that worldview in a subtle use of circular logic. Of course, we consider our own point of view the center of everything for Nietzsche, and yet unconsciously we help shape the reality that we think we see neutrally, or at any rate, we have it shaped for us. No text can read itself, no fact for Nietzsche is divisible of a particular interpretation. Our character in 1998's Metal Gear Solid Snake, wants to believe in a version of himself that conveniently reinvents yesterday. This brings what Nietzsche was famous for helping innovate to the center of how MGS1's story gets told, namely, psychology. By the end, Snake has to face down his demons and admit the truth, admit that all his life, Snake's never actually lived for himself. The will to power that you exercise as Snake beating the game, MGS1 wants you to carry with you as a genuine will to live your own life, and yours alone, for your own reasons, just like Snake learns to, too. This process of facing oneself and overcoming one's own greatest limits, of recognizing one's own psychology, of departing from a life of alienation and foreign-imposed values to a life whose meaning and outcome we take responsibility for alone. All this is the process of our evolution for Nietzsche, from Homo sapiens to Homo superior, to what he famously dubbed the Overman. He thought we'd either overcome ourselves this way, or wind up somewhat like Snake at the start of MGS1, as the apathetic, even nihilistic, so-called last man. The man that Western civilization has improved, has domesticated. MGS1 ends calling on us to truly live, to embrace wholeheartedly what Nietzsche called our latent will to power, which for him was the sole animating force behind all of life, just like MGS1 tells us via Psychomantis. This drive to pass on our DNA, to not just survive but flourish over generations, to not just exist here and now but live yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that is Nietzsche's will to power. Yet as much as the will to power is a good thing that we have to accept, it's at the same exact time the source of all strife, all that stands against us, all that threatens the human experiment, if you will. In case the solid liquid snake conceit wasn't clear enough here, for Nietzsche, as for Kojima, often humanity is our own worst enemy. The last man is how Nietzsche feared this trajectory of so-called modern Western civilization would inevitably lead, unless we could, by him, be warned. We see this in MGS, in the so-called peace and progress and civility that followed the Cold War. Underneath this veneer of security, MGS1 tells us it's now more easy than ever to obtain nuclear weapons on the black market. Once the value system of post-monotheistic, rationalist, capitalist societies dominated the world, Nietzsche feared the human spirit would lose its proper inner warrior, that selfish and small-minded values like comfort and peace and convenience and conformity would rot and debase us intractably as a whole.
Stopping the nuclear launch, rescuing the hostages, it was all just a diversion.
A diversion?
The Pentagon only needed for you to come into contact with us. That's what killed the Arms Tech president and decoy octopus.
You don't mean...
That's right. You were sent here to kill us so they could retrieve Metal Gear undamaged, along with the bodies of the Genome soldiers. From the beginning, the Pentagon was just using you as a vector to spread Fox dye.
Fox dye? It can't be.
As he would write in his magnum opus, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, with whom lieth the greatest danger to the whole human future? Is it not with the good and just? Like Snake in MGS 1, Raiden, our protagonist in MGS 2, is yet another last man, created by the just and the good. The last man is neither a master morality nor a slave. It is the moral outlook of nothingness, of myopic nihilism, of failing to embark on the necessary fight of self-discovery for human beings that truly makes us alive, of becoming in a way no different than an automaton. Like Nietzsche, Kojima warns us of modern life's pleasant vapidity, its ultimate dreamlike emptiness. Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 alike call on us at the evolutionary fork in the road, dividing paths of the last man on the one side from the overman on the other, to do what's best for our species and our future, rather than just ourselves or the moral legislations of our own present tense. But it's a delicate balance for Nietzsche between doing what's best for the future of humanity and refusing to see selfishness in any absolute sense as a kind of sin. The idea that morality is inherently defined as selflessness, benevolence, charity, and peace is something that Nietzsche is deeply suspicious of.
When all is said and done, peace is nothing but a fantasy. A game is a game. You either win or you lose. All you can do is fight. Stop me if you can. The peace sign is the V of victory. Say, peace.
While MGS1, like the MSX duo had, merely played around with moral skepticism and subversive Nietzschean anti-authoritarian politics, MGS2 is one of the most ardently philosophical games in history. MGS2 introduced an entire generation, mine, to deep yet elementary philosophical questions for the first time. It's no coincidence MGS and Nietzsche are both often cited as people's first entry points into philosophy and history and politics during adolescence. Both have a blunt force to them, yet a heady depth, a vitality and immediacy and swagger, all of which appeals very greatly to young people. And much of that began for Kojima here with MGS2. Created at the dawn of modern artificial intelligence, at the start of a new century, in the wake of the most serious American political scandal since Watergate, the Lewinsky incident, and right alongside, as ironic history would dictate, the worst American public tragedy since the assassination of JFK, 9/11, MGS2 took players down the rabbit hole no less mind-blowingly than a major influence on it, 1999's The Matrix. The game ended by leading the players to question virtually everything, which Nietzsche would have certainly approved of. Questioning what we know and who we are and how we know anything at all. MGS2 followed Nietzsche's doctrine not only of suspicion, but of so-called perspectivism. Encyclopedia Britannica defines perspectivism as the following concept. Knowledge is always perspectival, and there are no immaculate perceptions, objective knowledge, i.e. facts, given they'd require seeing an object from every possible vantage point simultaneously, and as an idea of what's possible become incoherent. End quote. But as much as this Nietzschean notion of perspectivism informed the game, MGS2 would draw no less considerable influence from the thinker's moral ideas, and how Nietzsche posited the power of words and values take dominion over our so-called free, rational wills over time. This philological, meaning history of ideas approach to understanding culture, politics, and history would become doubly important to the ultra-Nietzschean Metal Gear Solid 3 in 2004. And from Metal Gear Solid 2 to 5, we see over and over again, as we'll get to in the next episode, MGS expressing Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence. Metal Gear Solid 3 told the origin story for the entire series. This allowed the game to chart a Nietzschean development over eons of moral ideas, of our ever-shifting, prismatic notions of right and wrong, of truth. After MGS 2 ended with a heartfelt pledge to pass something of our own on to the future, MGS 3 is that testament, that promised account of all of Kojima's generations, joys, fears, and sorrows, its faiths and sins, using all the magic of the digital age to allow future generations to read the messy history by its light. Like Nietzsche's magnum opus, the philosophy, poetry, literary hybrid Thus Spoke Zarathustra, MGS 3 depicts not so much a single philosophy or virtue, as the failure of that virtuous philosopher to be understood in the era that needs them and needs them to carry out their act of self-sacrifice. From philosophers to soldiers and all worthy pioneers, we see how great women and men are chewed up and then disposed of by the times that don't deserve them. MGS 3 shows us a hero who, in Nietzsche's words, has come too soon, who goes voluntarily into the madhouse, who sacrifices her reputation, her legacy for future generations, who dares to challenge and betray the times, who sacrifices her own memory as known by the public, all for a chance at making a lasting, if unremembered, real change. The boss is Kojima's greatest character. It's no coincidence she's by far his most Nietzschean. The boss epitomizes the creator of new values, and yet in the end she succumbs to that dreaded specter of the last man. Nietzsche is known perhaps overmuch as the warrior philosopher, the tough and manly sage of darkness. In truth, there is a gentleness beneath Nietzsche's coarse exterior that, like the boss's, is almost maternal. The tragedy of the boss is she let her sense of duty to the world and to tomorrow override her will to create and live today by values that she forged all on her own. The boss's quietude in the face of her own annihilation, her loss of a will of her own, of power to create and only to destroy, it all describes the terrible trajectory that Nietzsche feared the last man represented for Homo sapiens. If the boss is the first last man, it's because she was the first natural-born master to let slaves turn her into something even less than a slave 2.0, if you will. And that, should this video receive 15,000 views in the first 2 weeks, will bring us in part 2 to 2008's quintessential depiction of this concept of the last man, MGS4. Until next time, boss.